Well, guys, welcome to the program. My name is Jae Wilson. I am a freelance consultant through my company, Onyx Reporting. And here I've got three of the smartest Domo people that I know. I'm super excited to have them here today. Welcome, guys. And we're going to talk about DevOps and doing stuff in Domo and managing change and tools that we can use to manage change better. But I guess, can you guys quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure, yeah, I'll go first. I'm Bard Higgins. I'm a freelance Domo consultant. I've been working in Domo land for about 5 years, 2 years on the client side, and then 2 years in the consulting partner network. Out on my own right now, just focusing on training and enablement for a variety of clients.
And Bart, if you would say you had one super secret skill, or maybe just one super skill, it doesn't have to be secret. What is like the part of Domo that you think you spend the most time on?
Data pipeline. So my pre-Domo background was all ERP and big enterprise systems. And so having spent 2 years in the consulting world and probably touched 60 projects in that time, all of these big ERP systems are kind of structured the same. They all kind of have the same problems getting the data out. And so I spent a long time trying to figure out how to optimize finance, supply chain, sales operations, things like that, getting that data out of your ERP and into Domo.
Wicked. And Grant, who are you? We've had you on the channel before.
We have. My name is Grant Smith. I am the major Domo at Sweetwater Sound. Been working with Domo for probably 2.5 years or so at this point. And I think at this point, probably the thing that I really enjoy working with Domo and doing is just finding kind of unique solutions to things, whether that's certain things with the APIs or the beast modes or any sort of pipeline optimization type of a thing. Is really always is fun and tricky at times, but rewarding.
And guys, just in case you missed it, Grant, it wasn't an interview. He spoke at the Idea Exchange conference, and his video about beast modes is the most watched video on my channel, which really upsets me because I've created a lot of content, Grant. So there's that. We'll link that in the video. But also, Grant, in the interview we did, you mentioned that you spend something like two hours a week or so on governance stuff between all of the different data flows and departments that you're supporting at Sweetwater. And actually, that was a large part of why I wanted to bring you in, is because you have that, the three of us, me, Bard, and John, we're consultants, but you have that like customer-facing experience, and I'm really intrigued to hear more about what you at your organization are doing in terms of the governance and DevOps. But John, last but not least.
Right, so I'm John Stevens. I'm a co-founder of a consulting and app company called Crystal Ballers. Before that, I spent 6 years at Domo, 4 of which I was the major Domo for Domo. I was the admin for the Domo system, working with everyone at Domo to build them whatever they needed. And now we do consulting, and we're trying to build, or we have built a handful of apps to try and help Domo processes and other things go a little bit smoother and easier.
Jason, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. Who are you? What do you do at Domo?
Hi, my name is Jason Altenburg. I work at La-Z-Boy Incorporated. We have had Domo installed now for about 5 years. And when I was working in our warranty services department, and I was a Domo power user there, I was one of the champions for our department. And I have recently, within the past year, assumed the role of, well, basically being in charge of Domo. What you just said, you can do a whole lot of stuff with Domo, but I think that, we have an instance right now that is has a lot of people in it. There's a lot of folks using it. It was originally implemented by our strategy and analytics department, but now it's fallen under the role of IT. And so I am in IT and I'm in shared services, and I'm currently in charge of our Domo instance, as well as handling a number of our other analytics functions within the organization.
Jason, how many users would you say are touching Domo on a daily basis ish?
In our organization, we have about 700 active users.
700. And Grant?
We're about 500 right now.
That is amazing.
30-ish.
And how many admins? How many people are administering Domo?
4.
4. And Jason?
It's me.
Just one man. That's amazing. That's amazing.
We have some other people that do some setup and things, but generally, as far as what we're doing with our company pages, our pages and cards and things like that. I'm the one that's in charge of it right now. So we're
That's
trying to
amazing.
do some general cleanup and some governance activities around it, but it's a lot to do.
Yeah. Now, John, you have built a custom app, the Major Domo app, to help users kind of manage all of the little pieces of Domo that can change over time. And obviously you're rapidly expanding it. But I guess before we get to that, Grant, I would love to hear a little bit about like the different personas, the different roles that you have set up in Domo, how you think about distributing roles and responsibilities. Because surely for a team of 4 or 5, and in Jason's case, 1, like it can't all be a one-man show. So how do you guys kind of divvy up the roles?
Well, what we do is we have a lot of just regular users who are just there to consume the data. And we also have essentially some team champions that or what we call Domo agents, where they will be sort of the point of contact for their department of, hey, this is a Domo question I have. And they'll be creating data sets, data flows, visualizations, things like that. And being really in charge of their data. And then if they have more technical questions or need more assistance or different types of data maybe they don't have access to, then they'll reach out to my team and say, hey, we need this, or how can we solve this problem, sort of thing. So we're more sort of a center of excellence type of a thing, sort of a model if you're more in terms of data governance, that sort of a thing where each team has their own agent. Some teams don't, and so that kind of falls to us at this point. But there are a lot of those, just a handful of those throughout the company that we do have, which help alleviate a lot of the need for our team to do things.
So you're running kind of a hub and spoke model, I think is
exactly
how it's also referred to. Okay. Yep. And were you always there at that hub and spoke model, or is that something that kind of happened over time?
Well, so it's always been there. Originally, we started with one guy running Domo and being in charge of all of Domo. And then there were sort of the team champions all throughout the company, of which I was one in the marketing team at that point. And so it just kind of sort of grew from there. And as we're adopting more and more people, it continues to grow.
When you think about a new report request or requirement, who delivers it? And then how do you, once it's been delivered and implemented, how do you maintain trust that the data quality is good, that the data is good, that the dashboards that people are looking at are good?
One thing we're trying to leverage a lot so right now is certifications, and so let them know, hey, there's this little blue circle with a check mark that says, yep, you can trust this. Now, it may not necessarily be for the entire company, it may just be for their specific department, but we're trying to leverage those agents that we have to go in and say, yes, this has been certified for our department. So anyone in our department knows that, yeah, you can use this and certify this. And there are times when I wish that more things would be certified, but we are getting there and working on that.
Jason, what about you? Do you guys find yourself using certification workflows very often? And especially given that you're a one-man band, how do you keep yourself from becoming kind of the bottleneck in it all?
Right now, we have a lot of different agents that are doing what Grant was saying. We have individual team champions that have editor access. They have the ability to go in to make their stuff, and it's really up to them how they build out their area for their vertical. So a little bit of an issue with that right now that we're trying to address through some various data governance activities is that, if you have everybody can do whatever they want, it can quickly sort of become the Wild West in a way. And so what we're doing through our data governance activities is we're looking at master data management. We're going to be utilizing Atacama, and we're actually going through a pretty intensive company-wide data governance roadshow / activity / program that we're going to be getting everybody on board. We're sort of an old school manufacturing company, but as I've been hearing a lot lately, we are now a data company, and so that's something that we're just sort of coming to terms with, and we're trying to make sure that we have trust in the data that's out there, which right now is heavily through the individuals that are providing that data. But obviously that's not a good long-term solution, especially if we have any sort of turnover in departments or if people go places. we need to have the trust in the data itself, not necessarily in the person who's providing it, because then, you know, is Jay's data as good as Grant's data, as good as John's data? You know, whose data are we going to be using for making these decisions instead of having like a single source of truth or having golden records? We tried using a little bit of the stuff in Domo, but without a strong data governance program behind it and without buy-in across the organization, we really weren't able to fully and successfully utilize the certification in Domo and the data governance tools that are provided. But I feel confident that once we are a little bit more well-versed in the subject, once we know more about data governance, I think once we're through these activities and once we are all on board with the abilities that we have with our master data management, that we're going to be able, it's going to be a lot easier for me to say, hey, look, Domo has this stuff too. We can use it here just as well as we're using it in other areas within the organization or other applications.
So clarifying question, are you saying that you're currently evaluating vendors who provide master data management software?
No, we are going to be using Atacama as a platform for master data management.
It's interesting to me that it sounds like you're going to turn to another software to solve what you described as a process and technology problem.
No, and that's
John
what I'm saying too, is that I think we're going to have a lot more success once we all understand the goals that we're trying to accomplish through the data governance activities.
I guess Bart and John, as the resident consultants on data governance and data strategy and these things, are there any tools that come to mind right off the bat that people need to be thinking about in Domo as they're starting to progress into these conversations?
Like my personal experience, outside of kind of that big umbrella of governance where you're establishing naming conventions, right? This is how I know what this data set is. I'm tagging my data sets, whatever that looks like. Like I haven't seen a very consistent or a super successful approach to some of this, you know, the overall data governance, the overall change management strategy. Like it's just not built into Domo. And so kind of like what you're talking about, Jason, we're going over here to do master data management and we're building some internal controls for these other things. Like that's kind of the typical path that I've seen. Like in general, the change management conversation either never happens, it happens and we realize the tools don't really support it, so we don't do it, or we start going down the path of copy the ETL, copy the cards, make your changes there, do your QA there. And once that is done and signed off on, then you've got a couple different ways to roll those things back into production, right? Move the ETL changes back or move the cards over. But none of those gates are systematically controlled. It's all has to be done manually. It all has to be handled by the users. And so, and I would really love to hear like Grant and Jason's take on this being so ingrained on the customer side, but what I see happen there is even if you get to the point where you've enabled that change management process, you very quickly start coming up with exceptions like these kind of changes can just happen in production because they're easy and they're low risk. And kind of like you were talking about, Jason, like I'm the user that built the data set. I know the source data. I'm 99% sure I can do this without cratering my dashboards and jeopardizing trust, right? But like documenting that, turning that into a process, codifying it, like I've never seen anyone be able to do that.
Successfully in Domo, you mean?
Specifically in Domo. Yeah, I can think of others, like I can show you kind of how we used to do things in ERP land, but within Domo specifically, like that bucket of here's the things I do in production just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you're just hot fixing everything, right? Like that's every project I've been on, we either never talk about it or that's where we
we just dance around it. Yeah.
And so so like where I struggle with this is like when people ask me this question, there isn't a great answer within the Domo tool set for this change management. But the flip side to that is like if this were a really big problem, you'd think Domo would have addressed it by now. And by and large, like it doesn't feel like it's a really big problem. And like coming out of Domo Palooza this year, like there's a part of me that's thinking, is this part of this move towards modern BI and that catchphrase that we're seeing all over Domo land right now, where we do iterate fast and we do make changes and we break things sometimes, but that's okay because it allows us to get to the end result faster. So
I have such mixed feelings.
me too.
Oh
I'm
my
super
gosh.
excited. Yeah.
I both equal parts love it and hate that idea at the same time. John, what are your thoughts?
So when I was at Domo, we had a really unique situation because everybody in Domo is a privileged user, every employee of Domo. So we had 1,000+ people that were all privileged, at least.
Mhm.
And so anybody could create literally anything, and because it's Domo, there was a lot of stuff that was developed before the tool, even the current tools existed. And my team, half the time we couldn't actually clean up anything or govern stuff because there was literally no way to do that. What we eventually came up with as a way to, I don't know, have internal process to try and fix some of these problems was we did start going down the master data set route. And I found that this was really, really helpful for everything we did. And it was also helpful when I moved on to the consulting side, helping our customers, especially when doing data science, to really nail down what the master data set needs to be. And the core principle behind all of that was, what does a row represent? Because if we could figure out what a row represents and have a master data set for that row level granularity, that then becomes certified. That's the only thing that anybody can use. And anything that makes sense in terms of additional columns or removing columns, we can manage that. And so we would often have code reviews. So we had 3 admins for the Domo system. We would review each other's code. We would make sure, we would test and check. But we always knew what the row count was supposed to be. So it was a really easy check when we added things to see if we had broken something.
Mm-hmm.
And what that then allowed is everyone knew, here's the master data set for this, like for every opportunity, here's the master data set for accounts, here's the master data set for whatever. And we had those. And then other people would take those master data sets and would sometimes combine them with other things for their specific uses.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing got certified unless it was one of these master data sets. As Domo grew a little bit, and we developed an analytics department in addition to just the admins, then those people were responsible for the master data sets for their department because they usually had unique row level data, and for certifying anything else. So as requests came, everything was based off those core data sets, and then moved and augmented as appropriate. But
Yeah.
nothing came before the executives or anything else unless it was one of these core certified master data sets.
I vaguely recall that there would be every data set about Salesforce opportunities belonged to one owner, and that owner was always the person next to Salesforce _ whatever the thing is. That was their name, and anytime we had a question about a metric, we're supposed to talk to that person because they owned the data set. Grant, in your hub and spoke model, has the implementation been relatively similar to what John's doing or was doing at Domo, or did you guys kind of go a different route? And what do your cleanup activities, your weekly cleanup activities look like?
For the most part, it's pretty similar to what John was describing. I mean, each team kind of is in charge of their data and is making sure that, hey, yeah, that's correct. There are a lot of data governance type of cards and metrics that we have sort of come up with on our own, and have this really, some say beautiful, some say ugly data flow that I've created, which is quite complex, where we are sort of trying to identify potential issues that we have and any sort of users who may or may not be at a certain threshold. So we kind of give them a sort of an overall score of like, okay, how good are you at following these processes and these standards that we have in place? And then trying to kind of reach out to them and say, hey, look, you're kind of falling below here. We need to kind of make sure you address these things and do these things. And we sometimes will try and have some sort of competitions and things like that, so you can, make the greatest improvement, that sort of thing, and potentially give out some prizes is what we're looking at in the future. But to really kind of help get those things sort of cleaned up.
So in your hub and spoke model, you're saying you're actually looking at the people creating content. You are trying to score them, assess how good they are at following a rubric or set of criteria for how they maintain their instance and implement ETLs and all this.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
Dude, that's really clever. And Bart and John, I know you guys are working on expanding consulting teams. That would be a really interesting way of like your seniority as your title as senior partner or senior technical consultant is not how many years you've been at it, but how consistently you follow the rubric, how consistently you follow the conventions. I think even having conventions, Grant, is something that I don't see very often. Is there any chance you could share? Like, do you have it written down, some of the things that people get scored on that you could share with us?
Well, a lot of it is like, is this card being viewed, right? When's the last time this card was looked at, right? And are they creating stuff that is actually being used, or is it just kind of sitting out there in languish? Our data flows and data sets, are they processing correctly and successfully, or are they having a whole bunch of errors, or are they becoming stale? Do they have the correct prefixes that we are expecting?
Oh,
whether
wow.
it's like a development or production or historical sort of a data set. We've got several others in there, but sort of those types of things. So we know specifically, hey, this is this kind of data. We need to do these kind of checks on it. And we also have a lot of different tags that we have requirements for that we'll make sure that those are in place as well.
Okay, so you're using this rubric to assess how clean people are keeping their instance, how good they are at sanitation and stewardship, less so actually the implementation and design of their data flows or pipeline.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I love this. I want to really quickly share something that kind of I was thinking about as I was preparing for our little session today. You know, when we talk about the momentum methodology, right? Those of you who've done a Domo project or have been a Domo consultant, we talk about momentum. We talk about, okay, you have your kickoff, your design phase, your connect, transform, visualize, and then engage the audience. But we talk about the fact that it's this iterative process that we go through this cycle of implementation and then adding new features and so on. And it's actually remarkably similar to like the DevOps cycle: plan, code, build, test, release, deploy, operate, monitor, plan, code, build, and so on, like this infinity loop. And what's interesting to me is like there's a couple like, and Bart, I think you already said it, there's a couple pieces missing. Like we'll build, we're not always great at testing or UAT. There's really no deploy phase. Like we usually just do it all and we do all of our implementation in production. We don't often have like a separate development environment. And it was interesting, Bart, you're like, well, maybe we just move fast enough that that's the pace we go at, is we don't really have to do testing. And we just, you know, if it's a problem, we just fix it on the fly. And I guess my one thought there is that totally works if the job can be finished in a day. But if the job doesn't finish in a day or in X number of hours and I walk away from the job, my data flow could be borked. It could be broken and it's not refreshing. Is there a way to mitigate the impact on the end users? And do you guys have any pro tips there?
I don't know that I have any pro tips for how it works in Domo today. You know, where, like you said, fast and loose. Like most of the projects I've worked on, because Domo is a younger platform, it's generally net new customers, new clients. So we are starting things from scratch. And so for the first part of the engagement, while we're actively building, while we're thrashing through stuff, nothing is in production, nothing's being actively used. So everything is QA. As soon as you kind of make that switch and something is deployed and roll out, like that's theoretically when the gates start coming into play and you've got to start running through some sort of change management and validation process. You know, the standard copy thing we were talking about earlier, copy the ETL, copy the cards, make the changes there. Like that's not a big deal when you have one dashboard and one data set powering it, right? As soon as you've got multiple use cases, once you've got lots of users in, that can become cumbersome and kludgy. And so that's when I think you start seeing that fall back to the, yeah, I can just rip this out in production. And, you know, as long as the data set completes in a reasonable amount of time, as long as this isn't one big change, you know, it isn't generally that impactful. And it is the one place in Domo where like the ETL versioning is a very good way to recover quickly, right? You can back up to when you know it was working and get it back out the door. So to that end, you've got the fallback strategy in place, but you know, that middle of your infinity loop there, test, deploy, release piece, like I would love somebody to show me a great way to do that in Domo and minimize that risk.
So my process was always, again, assuming I know what the granularity is, and that's not changing. If I need to change anything, I will add column. I would, again, copy the data flow, have my dev version, or just have a stable dev version that I know is roughly has parity. And everything was just a new column every single time. Even if it was going to be changing an existing column, I would always keep the existing column with the existing name structure, create a duplicate of that, do whatever else I needed, but always have a new column that I then prepend with dev. So it's a development column. And that way I can, all the cards maintain themselves, all downflow data flows, nothing's impacted because it's just a new column and nobody should be using it because I just made it. And so then I can go into the cards or anything else, start doing validation, seeing what is changing. So I remember we had a thing where we were changing from the core metric being ACV to TCV. So annual contract value to total contract value. And it was a big change. We knew it was going to impact a lot of our stuff, but they wanted that to be the main amount field. And so we brought all those in, and then we had to do the analysis to say, okay, what is the actual change on these major cards and the main dashboards that we're going to do? And I did all of that, separately with these development columns, so that I was able to see that right up, like, here's the expected change. We already know what it's going to be because we can see them and compare the two. Here's everything, write that up, send that out to the stakeholders. And then once everyone is convinced that it's right, we've got sign off from the executives or whatever, we're like, okay, just so you know, we're now going to change the amount field so that it reflects TCV, not ACV. I may have that backwards. Anyway.
You just blew my mind.
Anyway,
I'm just
so
like,
that's why we would do that. And then because it's all in a data flow, all we do is then rename, like comment out the original amount field and point it to TCV. And then we're good. And that way all the cards happen. Now, there were occasions where, again, as we were doing our user testing and figuring out like, okay, how does this impact this department versus this department? They'd say, no, like for all of our stuff, TCV does not work. We need ACV. I'm like, okay, we're going to have both columns there anyway. And eventually, so we started going down the path of let's just swap out amount. And when we figured out all of the user requirements, we actually ended up saying, never mind, like we will amount's going to point to this other thing, but we are going to have now explicit columns for both ACV and TCV so that if you have those needs, those are available. And then over time, we'll try and switch out from the generic amount field to the specific column, with the idea being eventually let's retire the entire amount column altogether because it's ambiguous. I don't know that we ever got there because there are so many things built off that, but we were able to say, like, to everyone who was building cards, like, go use the right field, use the more explicit field and naming convention. But in case you have something that you don't want to touch or that someone's forgotten about and uses once a year, that amount field will still be there and it will still work.
So, question for you, because it's something that's come up, and I don't know if this exists or not, but the impact analysis you just described, like if I want to know every card that's using a column, does that metadata exist? Like, is it exposed to the user? So you can get that. Okay.
yeah. If you use the Domo governance,
It's in there.
cards, fields, and beast modes,
Got it. Cool.
that data set will have one row per field that's used in a card. And so you would be able to report every data set, every card that uses the column called amount, for example.
So you can reasonably automate the impact analysis of changes like that.
That's
Okay.
bonkers,
Yeah.
dude.
We had to do that before that existed, and so it didn't happen. But yeah, now that exists, we can actually go back and finish that. And like with grant stuff as well, figuring out how long a card has been used, that's so helpful in cleanup to say, yeah, like there's 50 cards that use this stupid column, but no one's looked at them in 4 years. Like just delete them, get rid of them, and clean up the instance in general.
I love that. Grant, what about you? You do a lot of, analyzer stuff, but I also know you do a lot of really clever things in ETL. Do you have any like little tips or tricks for mitigating, people logging into a dashboard and all of a sudden all the cards are broken?
I think similar to what John was saying is I like to try and utilize views now, so more so. They're still in beta, so it's not heavily using them yet at this point. But when they do get fully released, I think we're going to try and utilize those a lot more, so that we are renaming the columns to be all the same name. It's all have a good sort of user experience for, hey, yeah, this is what this is, rather than like tote underscore amount or something, right? Where it's like, what exactly is that? What total amount is that? That's kind of John was describing too. And the other thing too is that it allows you to say, all right, hey, use this view as sort of like the productionized view, and then you can then sort of swap out fields as you need. Like John, kind of like John was saying too, is this like, let's just swap that out so that we don't have any sort of downtime of things.
Yeah, that was actually a really clever feature of the data set views, where if I use a view as the semantic layer, the layer just that the visualizations are built on, I can pop in a data set V1, data set V2, just change the underlying data set. And as part of that process, if a column no longer exists, it can ask, oh, does this map to a different column? Has this been replaced with a different column? That's a super clever solution. I like that.
Yep.
that. At some point, I was asking myself, nobody likes talking about governance. It's the least sexy thing, but like, what kind of stuff can change if I update a data flow or if I update a data set? Beast modes. If I change a column, right, beast modes can break. Cards and dashboards can obviously break. The content of a data set can change. If you've seen any of my YouTube videos, one of the things I'm a strong proponent of is, instead of adding columns to data sets, I think a little bit like John was describing, usually I union data sets. I have very tall, very wide, but sparsely populated data sets. And I'll use a column that I usually call it activity type to say, hey, this chunk of data is about the forecast, and this chunk of data is actuals, and that chunk of data is production. But one of the things that bit me hard recently is I had a column called activity type to separate all of them, but then I changed the activity type from actuals to actuals finance. And then all of the cards that were looking for the text actuals, because I use a lot of case statements, all of a sudden stop working. So data set content can be one of those things where you're like, the content of a column changes and all of a sudden everything breaks. We know schemas change. PDP is also another interesting thing to think about, right? We do a lot of automation using PDP. We're pushing ourselves to use trusted attributes. If your source system, if your SSO changes the way your trusted attributes are set up, your PDP could break. What else can change? ETL. We build, one ETL feeds another ETL, feeds another ETL. If I change a column, now my ETLs are breaking. The alter tile is worth $1 million, because instead of doing a hard select of the columns I'm looking for, the alter says, just change these things and pass everything through. So Magic 2, huge step in the right direction. Data pipeline, another thing that can change, especially as we try to make our data flows better, faster, stronger. I worked on a project where we were using Enterprise Stacker and Data Assembler, and actually turned to find out Magic 2 was faster. And so changing our pipeline to use a different data flow or a different set of tools could have cascading impacts on the dashboards that we see at the end of the day. Think about how long it takes your pipeline to update, or how quickly all of the different inputs run or don't run. Custom apps, product features, and connectors. When Domo changes a product feature, or when Domo changes a connector, that can also have an impact on what is coming out in my data, in my dashboards. So I'm not saying you need to be tracking all of these things, but these are definitely some things I encourage my viewers. I know you guys are already on top of this. I encourage my viewers, though, to keep this on your radar for different things to be aware of. For half of these things, data governance, the data governance data sets will get them done. But John, you're the data scientist. If I wanted to keep track of the content of my data using some sort of data profiling, do you have any clever tricks there for making sure that it stays the same, or it's not all of a sudden it's weird, or I'm getting weird results?
Yeah, so when I was on the data science consulting team, that was one of the first things we did because we had to understand the data before we could do any machine learning modeling. And so we actually developed a script that would hit endpoints and create a profile page for every data set that we were looking at. And that would create one column per card. And the cards were fairly generic, but they showed us the distributions of things. If it was a numeric or a date field was just a bar chart. If it was a categorical, any sort of text field, then we would look at the proportions. But the main thing that was so helpful was we
You say
would
one
use,
column per chart?
sorry, one chart per column. Said it backwards. Sorry. So one.
Okay.
So I would have one card for every single column in the data set. So
What if I have a 90 column data set?
then I would have 90 cards.
And did it generate automatically, or did you do this by hand?
Oh yeah. Well, so they started out doing it by hand. I thought that was stupid. So I scripted it and then it was fine.
You scripted it. You have to tell me more. Just high level. What do you mean by you scripted it?
Okay, so we were talking about this in the ideas exchange. Darren talked about how there are big P public APIs and little P public APIs. I went and I found the APIs that Domo uses to actually create a card. I pulled down that JSON using Postman and figured out how I could create a template out of that. So I created a template for a histogram card, a template for a bar chart, like a horizontal bar chart, and a template for a vertical bar chart. And I gave them very specific beast modes, which looked for null data or summary statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So I could concat and see, okay, what's the sum, the standard deviation, whatever I needed, and have that in there. And then I used Python to grab the data set schema from Domo, get a list of all of the columns, and then for every single column, do a find and replace on the JSON to make so it changed the title, it changed the column that was being used and the data set, and then post that card to a new page so that I would have one card per column in the data set, which would give me one place I could go, and I could quickly scan through the entire data set and say, okay, this one is 30% null, but that's only 3 records, so I really don't care. Or it's, this one's completely null, or there's no variation in this column. It's all constant, like the batch last run dates a lot of times.
And guys, find a link to that video below where John walks us through how to do that.
So anyway, I was really proud of that, that it worked, and it was so nice. We then expanded it to do some other things, but the idea was we could have one page where we could look at everything and it would always update. That was nice. What we eventually did a little bit later is once the scripting tiles were available and we had those, we actually wrote a Python script that would generate all of the summary statistics in a table. And we would, I don't know if we ever got this far, but one of the plans was for monitoring the data set over time, we could actually look at those summary statistics to say, okay, what is the change that we saw from this time to last time and the count of the data, so we can see if it randomly doubled. What happened if standard deviation all of a sudden changed, or if the mean changed dramatically, what is that? And could we get an alert? Because if there are any dramatic changes, then something's going on somewhere upstream in the pipeline. Or at least we wanted to be alerted for it so we could go actually figure out what's going on and take some action.
Grant, I think my challenge for you, is to figure out how to do that in a data set view, because I feel like you would have to, if you could take your data and join it to the data set schema data set, you could blow out your data, one row for each column based off of the data set schema. Then all you got to do, have your column called column name, and then min, max, average, standard deviation. You could build a table card that summarizes it. I feel like this could be done without and then you just have one table that has all of your data. Then you take your daily snapshot, recursive data flow style, because we all love those. And then I can do a recursive data flow against a data set view. I think this can be done. Grant, you got this?
It might be a possibility. I'll have to play around with it and see.
I think this can be done, but that is super cool that you you were using Postman to hit APIs, alter the JSON, push that back up into Domo and create content, a little bit of automation there.
Yeah, so, and it can be done because I think for a customer recently, we just did that just on the count. So we're just looking at the count of the data set. Oh, maybe it wasn't. I don't know if we could get all the rest of the summary statistics because I think we're just counting the rows in the data set, but
Sure.
I'm pretty sure we could.
Yeah, why not?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm working on a project with a client who has this interesting requirement, which I've captured as constraints. So the constraints are the developers must own pushing the data into Domo, presumably using Workbench. The developers must own the ETL process and participate in user acceptance testing. But the developers are never allowed to see a complete view of the transformed data. I'm gonna let that one sink in for a minute.
How is that even possible?
Those are the requirements. And the general gist of it is they're like, well, we need the developers to construct the ETL because they're technical, blah, 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 but we don't want them to see certain metrics aggregated at a total, like salaries or profit margins or things like this. So we need them to be able to build the ETL, but we don't want them to see the full view of all of the data for our entire company because we're too exposed. Okay, in a nutshell, that's the requirement. So I came up with an interesting idea using publish. Now, typically with publish, we talk about having a parent instance and subscriber. And I do all of my ETL and stuff in the parent instance, and then I push content into the children. But something that not everyone is aware of is that you don't have to use the parent subscriber model. You could have a model of just pushing data from one instance of Domo into another instance of Domo. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a parent-child relationship. So the idea is, okay, what I'll do is I'll have us upload production data into the production instance of Domo using Workbench. The Workbench credentials are owned by the, let's call it the department administration. But that's not the person who does the ETL. They're not the data specialist. They're just a person who owns the credentials for pushing data into Domo. Now we're going to copy that production data. We're going to copy a sample of the production data into the developer sandbox. And we can use that using dataset view, which samples the data, or I can just, well, that's actually what I would do. I'd use dataset view to subset the data to like one department or one day of data or what have you. And I can use dataset copy to move the data from one instance to another. Check, done. Now, in my developer sandbox, I do all of my ETL work. You guys are all developers. We don't care about the final number. We don't care about the whole aggregate. I don't need that for UAT. I just need to know, do I have unexpected row growth? So I build my ETL in dev. I build cards and my dashboard in dev. Maybe it's a multi-step data pipeline, but the point is I do that all in dev. And then I pull in the administrator into the developer instance. They look at it and they make sure it QAs for that one sample of data. They have to know the right answer. Yeah. But once that QAs, then I can publish. I can use Domo publish to move the output data set and the cards and dashboards that have been built back into production. At this point, it's not looking at live data yet. It's not looking at full production data. So I then need to copy paste my data flow into production. Then I hook up my production data flow to production data, run it, and then change all the cards to look at the production output. My admin, my data specialist, is only an editor or something in the live environment. In dev, I'm an admin, but in production, I'm just Joe Blow. And that's a way that I can meet the requirements and do like a DevOps-y type build without seeing all of the production data. You can applaud later. Poke holes. I'm actually here for you guys to poke holes into this and tell me how this won't work.
My mind is kind of blown. I'm trying to still wrap my head around the use case.
Well, I mean, think of it this way. Like if instead of it being, well, we don't want you to see all of the data, what if it was, we have private information and we don't want the developers to see that private information? How can we empower our developers to do dev without compromising people's private information? Because in Domo, there is no way, really, no good way to say you can't see this column.
Do you use a view? So my question is, instead of moving the data from one instance to another instance using dataset copy, which is a great tool and use, and I like it, could you use a view to eliminate the columns that are just going to be passed through and sample the data so that the developer can stay in the same instance? They do everything off of a view, and once the ETL and the cards are all done, you just, you know, change the ownership of the data flow itself and flip the view for the full data. Would that work?
So
it seems like it simplifies just a couple of steps, but I don't know that it actually would fully.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. If I wanted to stay in just one instance of Domo, I could just set up the developers as participants or editors. But my concern was, and you guys all know this, all of the data in Domo is just one accidental share away from exposing all of your data, right? It takes all of one click. All I have to do is share a card against a production data set with myself. And then all of a sudden I can see all of the data. And my responsibility to my client is to say, hey, one, keeping it all in prod it's just an accidental way. And this other alternative is going to reduce like how many, you know how it is when you got to share data sets with people and like all of that headache. We don't want to have to worry about that. So I thought this would be a little bit more bulletproof. It also, I think, reinforces, and Bard, you were hinting at this, right? It reinforces we're not going to do all of our changes in production. We're going to do a proper like deployment of these master data sets, and we're going to alleviate the temptation to make changes in prod. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I did think it would be a little bit, I thought it might resonate with people who want that separate environment, as well as people who have that concern for data.
I'm going to put my client hat on for a second. If I want to implement a model like this, does that mean I'm paying for 2 instances of Domo?
And for publish?
Well, that's the thing, right? We can do it, John, to your point, we can do this for free in Domo, and it comes with the risk of it's not bulletproof, you're an accident away. If you want the enterprise security, if we're going to call it that, it does require something else. And it doesn't necessarily have to be published, right? We don't have to use publish to transfer the cards and dashboards into another instance of Domo. Do we? I feel like that you can do that in the Excel admin plugin.
I think so. You should be able to.
Yeah, migrated dashboard.
Yep.
No, publish would definitely make it easier. But guys, this is just one instance of dev prod. Where I saw this like getting really interesting is we have dev prod private and we have dev prod public, right? If I actually had PII data, I could make sure that the PII data only goes into the private instance of Domo. I only add a department that's supposed to have access, or people on an individual basis who are supposed to have access to that, and everybody else logs into public. And I can have different rules for how people can engage with that data, different sets of PDP policies, and I'm not one accident away from sharing the wrong data. That's the part, to me, I think Domo makes it a lot easier to do, all of the things we appreciate about Domo, but it also allows us to not think with the gravity and responsibility that ITIS approach InfoSec, information security?
I think back to like my ERP days, and we were a big Cognos shop back then. And the tools we had to manage code in the ERP system and code in Cognos, like you could edit things like your data model in production, but it was really hard. Like it was set up to where you edit in development, you export to test and re-import, you do all your testing, and then when you're done, you export and import into production, right? So like hot fixing it was easier to go through the code process than it was to go through a hot fix. So you could keep your environments in sync. Your impact analysis was automated. It was part of the tool. If you changed a column name, it would tell you these 6 reports will break. Like if you publish this is what's going to happen. And so like publish seems like the closest thing we have in the Domo tool set to mimicking that, but it then requires to like truly do it in multiple environments. So I'd be curious to know, like, if you like, could you come up with a way to have, you know, Bard's Domo instance -dev -test and -prod.domo.com and publish, and, you know, like, is there an enterprise tool out there that would support that type of functionality?
Like, does it exist, or would it be possible? Which one are you asking?
Could I get this in my Domo instance, or could I get this in my Domo environment without owning 3 instances of Domo?
Yeah, I think it'd be a pretty hard sell in our organization to get 2 more instances of Domo to be able to have, you know, essentially the ability to have a dev version of it.
And I think your point is, like, the cost implications aren't necessarily worth the value, but the cost is, to an extent, it's set up by Domo, right? Domo determines that, because theoretically we all have sandboxes.
Yep.
We could all go into developer.domo.com and set up a sandbox and functionally implement what I'm describing, minus the publish feature. And how much does a publish tool cost? Well, it's just moving stuff using APIs. So, like, does it have to be expensive? I don't think so. And actually, you know what, John, I think this is a perfect segue, because you are actually working on tools that will allow people to have a better DevOps flow. And I would love to see what you're doing, and give you a chance to chat about that.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot about this, you know, development to production, like a promotion workflow, because it's such an obnoxious problem, and there is no good way. I think, Jay, the what you've described is the optimal, most secure way. I can't think of a better one using Domo.
I'll take it.
Good. But I still think it sucks. So
wow, go away.
not you, but just the fact that Domo is built this way, that it's so hard. And so I've been thinking about it, and using the APIs, I think, is a way that you could potentially do a lot of this stuff. So I'll share my screen real quick, and let's see. So here's a management dashboard that I have in my sandbox instance. I think one of the interesting things you can do is, using a tool like Postman, you can pull all that information. So I've, you know, kind of dug in with the inspector, trying to figure out the APIs, and found this one.
Did you actually? That's how you got it? Just
that's how I get
inspecting
everything.
the page?
Yes. So this is my development process. If you want to copy it, I open up Domo, I open up developer tools, and look at the logs, the network traffic, and then I do something, and then I hunt through the APIs, and I figure out what they do and how they work.
Find the fetch request.
And I find the requests. So it's all REST requests. Domo's really good about that. They're usually pretty good about versioning. You can see here's a v3. And so using this, I can hit this endpoint, and I will get back here the JSON representation of the page. So here's the page ID. It matches the page ID in the request. And there's a whole bunch of information in here, like the title of the page, all of the cards. So type of page, titles, domain, sizes. And all of these IDs are the different card IDs.
And why is there no size argument for the?
Because it is a layout and it is dynamically sizing based on the layout definition, is my guess. Again, I just hit this one last night to try and figure out what's going on. And that's my assumption, that somewhere else in here, in all of this mess, there is actually the definition of how much space it's supposed to take up on the page.
And this is a layout, not a collection.
Yep. So this is this page. So it's layouts. You know, there's table cards. There's all sorts of stuff in there. And this is the definition that Domo has that actually builds that entire page.
And just for a second for everyone else, I remember trying to get started in this, and X developer token blew my mind. Where did you get your developer token from? How did you get that?
Okay, so the way you get a developer token, and I'm going to kill my developer token since this is recorded like in a day or later today, but you go into more, into admin. You need to be an admin to do this, security, and then access tokens.
Wait, really? What? No, that's not how you get a developer token. Really? It's just the access token?
Yes.
No.
There's two different tokens. There's the access token, there's a developer token.
This token is a developer token. You can do whatever you want with it.
I was under the impression that you had to use the full authentication API.
Find ID and secret?
No. The API that Workbench uses.
Nope.
You can just use your, that makes it so much easier. Well, there
You're
you go,
welcome.
guys. And this will solve the fully qualified, if you try to hit an API that requires the full domain authentication.
Yes.
And Grant, you were saying you can't use this because you're using SSO.
These will work.
Them.
Pardon?
I've had these work, I believe, with SSO. So these ones go around using the developer token. So I'm pretty sure I've used these exact tokens to access instances that are behind an SSO.
But you also have direct sign-on, assuming you also have direct sign-on.
I'm not sure. I don't remember. It's been a while.
Because this access token will allow you to pull data from Domo stats. Sorry, Domo governance.
It is required for the Domo governance things because the Domo governance data sets are hitting these very similar APIs.
Yeah.
Not the exact same APIs to do things. And so with this, I can post, I can pull all sorts of information. And that brings me to the other thing, because again, it's kind of a pain. So I'll pitch my app right now. So on this app, once you log in, hitting those same APIs that we were just talking about, we've updated the app. So again, it started with, you could just back up things from a page on all those cards, but now you can also back up from a specific data set. So if there's a data set you're wanting to delete or get ready to delete, and you just want to back up of all the cards, you can just do it from there.
Oh, wait. So I pick a data set and I can back up all of the cards on that data set.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal, because you know what, this solves a problem of, like, if I want to migrate from data set V1 to data set V2 in Domo, I can click the button, move all cards to the new data set, but there's no undo button if it blows up catastrophically.
You're right. This would allow that.
Ooh, this is worth the cost of admission alone. For anyone who's trying to go from data set V1 to V2, this is it right here.
Yeah. So we can back up from data sets. We've got data flows now as well, so you can back up the data flows. So all the data flow definitions, whether it's Magic ETL, Redshift, I don't care. It's all JSON. And so we can back all that up and then again, restore it.
And theoretically, it would be the same process like you were showing with Postman. I can hit an API that has all of my data flow data, and it'll give me a little JSON array of the thing.
Yep. So again, it's all the same, the same tooling. Like if you know how to work with APIs and you're willing to go hunt through the JSON, you can build your own tools to do this. I know a lot of people don't, so we built the tool to help with that. And then we added a scheduling component. So we can actually now schedule these things so it will back up on all your cards on the data set or the page or whatever, your data flows will back up on a schedule, and then you can restore them at any time.
You're only one feature away from replacing the publish tool, which is just being able to choose which instance of Domo it goes to.
And I'm working on it.
Can you take ETLA back it up and restore it on top of ETLB?
Not yet. So that's one of the things, and this goes into the whole promotion idea.
Right.
And because what we'd like to do is, and essentially what you need is a mapping table. And kind of like I talked about earlier, where I was able to go through, get the schemas, and then just do a find and replace in the JSON of, whenever you see this, test piece of text, replace it with a column name. Doing that same sort of thing, but more dynamically. So we could pull down the JSON and you could say, okay, remap to this. We know that this data set in instance A equals this data set ID in instance B. So replace it. If everything else is the same, then you should be able to push it and you could move from instance to instance. Or you could actually stay within an instance and say, here's my dev data flow and my dev stuff that is a little bit more open or is sampled or anything else. And then here's my other data set, which is PDP'd to the hilt and is the full data set. And I know is as secure as Domo can get it. And again, you would be able to just say, okay, replace the data set IDs for this and this, or this other text, so that we can move all cards. And we could either, and then if we mapped the page IDs and the card IDs, if we could do all of that as well, you could say, all right, here's version 1. It's just going to do a complete copy like you can do already in Domo. I will duplicate my development page to my production page. But if you had a mapping that then maintains those relationships, if here's card A, here's card B, then you should be able to say promote, and it will take the current version of development card A and replace card B or data flow B. So anyway, that's the project I'm working on right now, is trying to figure out how to best map all those things together so we can promote everything, and actually have a good promotion developer experience within a single instance of Domo, not having to use publish and these separate instances. Although we still have, again, a lot of those security concerns that Jay did talk about.
I guess so. Jason and Grant, you guys are the customers here. What would be the big, I mean, we obviously know this would save time and all of this. What is the feature that we need to make sure we're thinking about as we're developing and thinking about this as something to improve a DevOps pipeline?
I mean, that's essentially what we need in our environment to be able to have a little bit more control, is the idea of being able to have a sandbox or a dev area and be able to do that promotion process to a production server. Without that capability, it's very difficult right now for us to have any sort of private or personal PII in our Domo instance because of the audit concerns, and there's just it's needed, to be able to have that. I'm not sure how else to say it. We have this capability in our SAP software and business objects. We have a dev server with a production server. The promotion process is relatively easy. We set up a job. It takes stuff from our dev server to our prod server, and we're able to do that through our operations group instead of having it done, by individual users. It's part of our security, but there is just no real easy equivalent in Domo right now. And especially too with the idea that I guess on the Domo end of things, it's not necessarily something that's going to be solved by this app, is that, there is that possibility of additional cost if we did want to set up a sandbox or a dev server to be able to do this. We'd essentially be, if you're doing the row consumption based model for pricing, then you're going to double your row count unless you keep your dev server insanely clean. And again, without that promotion, even without that backwards promotion process, being able to pull prod back into test before prod back into dev and then push it back out, which I think is what you guys are talking about when you're just saying, I want to copy this data set over top of this one. We actually have one of our bigger data sets. We've got a great view of it, and there's a couple of features that I'm not sure exist right now. We're using the views, and we have there's the capability of joins, but I'm not sure if union is a possibility on those with the data set views.
It's coming.
But yeah, and so, but again, it's when, and is it going to be something that is free or at a cost? But that's aside.
Yeah.
So we have this new version of a data set, and it's a big one. It's one that powers 2,000 cards in our instance. How do we make that transition from here's our one set of data over to this new view without saying to all of our power users, which like Grant said, your Domo agents, you guys have to do all this work because I also want to keep them on my good side. And say, hey, you have to take your 400 cards and manually transition them. And they say how, and I say click, 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 click. Just make sure stuff doesn't break while you do it. It's not a great solution. Where I can see that something like this would, at least allow us to do some of that stuff, even if it is sort of like a backup and restore over top of. That's good. And keeping in mind too the idea of that promotion process is relatively standard in a lot of other sort of reporting and analytical offerings out there. Being able to mimic that would be huge.
I wonder, John, with the Domo CLI, with the CLI utility, you can take a data flow definition and replace an existing data flow definition. So I can take my JSON and replace data flow I with I45 with the new data flow definition. In doing so, right, you're right. The crappy part would be you would have to alter the output to the production data set. You just have to do that mapping part. And then the inputs, you would have to remap as well. But I'm wondering if you wanted to just get something out the door, could it be that you just promote the data flow with the expectation that in the immediate term, people have to go back with the CLI and alter the output to point to an existing data set? I know it's possible. I'm asking, would you be comfortable accepting that as a V1?
So you're saying like we just fully overwrite an existing data flow with a different one?
Yep.
I think that's a fine option. I'd be okay with that. Again, on our side, we just need to make sure that we have a mechanism, a function that accepts a parameter of what data flow ID do you want to write this to.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's
it wouldn't be that bad. That being said, you could do that just with the Java CLI by getting the data flow ID, writing it to a file, and then immediately pushing it to overwrite a different one. That's where I'm working through, right? Like all of this, I feel like is interrelated of the, how do you modify the JSON?
How do you find the thing that needs to be?
And make it easy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a UX thing than a technical thing. Like how do we make a decent user experience? Because the APIs exist, they're not hard, especially the data flow ones, not hard to work with, as the CLI shows. Like you really just need a data flow ID to pull and to push all that information.
I'm super excited for this. Because this workflow that we're talking about doing in publish is just, it's good. It's just so much. Okay, I guess we're kind of wrapping up here, guys. If you were going to give some advice to the new-ish Domo folks kind of hitting their stride 3 months in, 6 months in, what would you say is the most important thing, not tool, but like process or something that they should be thinking about right now that's going to ease their adoption and kind of governance journey? I'll start with Bard. Yeah.
The most important thing, but get some naming conventions and data management in place right away. If you don't do that, retrofitting it is harder, and then doing it up front makes it much easier, not just like for your technical ETL BI developers, but as new users come on board into Domo, when things are named logically, like it enables that self-service and allows new users to come in and find what they're looking for, as opposed to like the rat's nest that I typically see when I get into a data set.
Dude, we didn't even talk about data dictionaries. Does anybody have a smart way to automate that?
Not yet.
I tried building a data flow that would be like, okay, here are the rules, and then identify all of the things that break the rule and clean it.
Yeah.
And I'm like this close, and by this close I mean 12 hours. I think I'm 12 hours away from it, but I need somebody to work with on that project. So if anybody's bored and wants to automate renaming data sets, let's talk. And then to extend Bard's question, what tools should people be using to make sure that people are following data set conventions, naming conventions? Pop quiz.
Besides like the governance data sets.
What are the governance data sets, Bard?
Oh, sorry. The governance data sets are all the metadata about your instance.
So
Data
data
sets
set
are
schemas, cards,
users,
cards and
yeah,
users. Yeah.
activity log, things like that. Yeah.
Wicked. Thanks, Bard. Grant, what do you think? What's the most important thing process-wise that people should be doing and thinking about as they're scaling their Domo implementation?
I would say just making sure you know sort of a overall certification type process, right? Where you can make sure everyone is following the same steps, creating things the same way, having sort of a standardized view or design strategy for your cars and things like that, so that it's consistent throughout the entire instance. And so that way you have sort of the same mindset, and it's easier to go from one place to another place. And it's like, oh yeah, I know that color, that means this, and it's always going to mean that. And so it's just makes it a lot easier for those users to kind of do that mental switching in their brains.
And do you use any specific tools to help with that, or is that just a eyeball it and make sure people are behaving?
We have a list of standard colors and sort of a brand colorizations that we like to use, and we've got it all documented in our standards documentation. Says, hey, if it's this, use this color, and we'll give out the explicit like hex code color and stuff like that, so that we know it's going to be exact, and rather than, well, it looks like kind of like this, or maybe it's not kind of that.
You use a little style guide. I really strongly appreciate that. I feel like somebody should write a style guide for ETLs. One day. Jason, what about you?
Well, I know you already touched on it, but I think that having a data dictionary, a data glossary with buy-in on definitions at the highest organizational level possible, because something I heard recently during a discussion about this was that they said that they didn't think that, you know, people at higher levels would be that intimate with their data. But then we sort of segged into this idea of what is a customer? And is a customer somebody who has entered one of the stores that we own, or is a customer somebody who has purchased an item from one of the stores that we own? And right there is where I said, see, now they might not know what that looks like in the data, but people at the higher levels of our organization can very, very certainly make that distinction in who do we call a customer, who do we call a potential customer, who do we call a lead. And so I think it's important that you have that buy-in at the higher levels, especially when it comes to how do we define terms and how do we all speak the same language across the organization. Trying to get into the rat's nest of data and understand, you know, what is SMAN 57 PQY in this, you know, table is not going to help anybody. Yeah. Whereas if you can have something that says this is a customer, and a customer means it's somebody who has purchased a product from us, and that's been set by the director of retail, that's a lot easier to get people on board with.
You know, one simply of the, sorry, Grant, go ahead.
I was just saying simply too, you know, you don't even have to necessarily go into like specifically every table or every column that's on that data that you have, right? It's just simply just start with like, hey, what are our data entities, our data objects that we have? Like, what are the sort of the key business components, and what are those definitions? Start there, so that you can at least have a standardized definition of those, and everyone's thinking sort of the same concept of that case.
Yeah, absolutely.
A little tip for that. What is a customer? You know, every instance of Domo has at least one, probably 20 customer tables that are coming from Salesforce, coming from your ERP system, coming from GA. Obviously, you want to get to the point where you have one master customer table that has all of your customers. And regarding how do we define a customer, I got into the habit of using a binary flag, just a 1 or a 0. So I have a column called is customer. I write the logic case when this is true and that is true and that is true, then you're a customer. So 1, else 0. And then in your dataset schema on the data tab, you can put in the definition for this is what the rules are for defining a customer. And you can have a ton of binary flags. We were working on a project where we were talking about loan applications and we were adding a binary. Is it funded? What's the definition of funded? Is it warranty approved? I don't know what these words mean, but we just had a ton of binary flags. And what was really cool is when we wanted to know what was the total amount funded, we just do amount funded times my binary column. And if it is funded, then it's 1 times the amount. And if it's not funded, it's 1 times 0 or amount times 0, and it excludes itself. And that just made our beast modes so much cleaner. And I don't have to worry about like changing the definition in the beast modes. That's built into the master data set. I got super excited. I'm sorry. John.
No, it's really perfect because what you're saying though cannot happen without that clear definition.
Absolutely.
I can't look at an entity in my data and say yes or no, or even worse, having a whole bunch of different analysts defining that independently throughout the organization based on their personal preference.
Yeah.
It's not as easy. I am a big fan of 1s and 0s as well.
That's super cool. Guys, we're 5 minutes over and I'm 5 minutes late for a call with a client. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your time, guys. We're going to pick this up another time. I really appreciate having you. Catch you later.
See you guys later.
Bye.
Thanks all.